Hi everyone, I'm Julian. Bring your curiosity and welcome back to the Curious Table. Today, we are going to dive into the incredible business of the Ice King, a man who built an empire out of ice. Hello, Helena. Could you tell us more about the Ice King?
Hello. Some of you might have heard of him. In fact, back in the early 19th century, coldness was almost like a symbol of power that only kings and a very small number of wealthy people could enjoy. For ordinary people, it was a sensation they might never experience in their entire lives.
Yes, economically speaking, it was the ultimate luxury good. But the idea of taking this all the way to the equator and selling it to the masses was a challenge that went far beyond ordinary business. He wasn't just jumping into a market that didn't exist. He actually had to invent the desire for coldness itself, a craving that had never even existed in people's minds.
That is exactly right. Speaking as a chef, it was like selling a completely new sensation, not just a product. That crisp chill tingling on the tip of your tongue must have been an absolute shock for people who had only ever known lukewarm drinks their entire lives.
Our story begins right at that seemingly impossible point you all just mentioned. A luxury for royalty, a non-existent market, and an unimaginable sensation. Facing all these barriers, there was a 22-year-old young man who declared he would take the entire New England winter and plant it right in the Caribbean.
The result of that declaration was, of course, a disastrous failure. According to the records, he set sail with 130 tons of ice in 1806. Interestingly enough, the ice did not melt during the voyage. The real problem was that there was not a single warehouse to store the ice at the destination port. Ultimately, he had to watch helplessly as the ice melted away, leaving him with a mountain of debt totaling $4,500.
$4,500 in 1806 is a massive amount of money, easily worth well over $100,000 today. An ordinary person would have been crushed and given up everything right then and there, but Tudor saw right to the heart of the matter. Through that failure, he realized the problem was not the ice itself, but the lack of a system to keep it intact. In the end, that massive loss was the world's most expensive tuition fee, teaching him exactly where the most vulnerable point of his business was.
Calling it the most expensive data is exactly right. Ultimately, the key was not just the technology to keep the ice from melting, but building a complete system to preserve that coldness, right up until the final moment it reached the consumer's glass. This is where Tudor's true genius begins to shine.
Oh, so the real issue was not the voyage itself, but what happened after they arrived. Speaking as a chef, this goes way beyond simply transporting ingredients. It is like managing the entire process from farm to table, and this was in an era without any refrigerators or cold storage. What kind of brilliant method did he come up with to build that massive ice house?
Exactly, it was sawdust. This is where Tudor's genius truly shines, as he solved a problem of his era, using the resources of his era. For the sawmills in the American Northeast, which were another byproduct of the Industrial Revolution, sawdust was nothing more than a troublesome industrial waste. Paradoxically, Tudor found the absolute perfect solution to preserve his ice, right inside the very waste that everyone else was throwing away.
That right there is the heart of this innovation. This goes far beyond simply cutting costs. He took a negative asset that others had to pay to get rid of, and turned it into a positive asset that no one else could replicate. Ultimately, the biggest headache for the sawmills became a deep and wide economic moat for Tudor, one that his competitors could never cross.
Turning waste into a core competitive advantage is truly a massive paradigm shift. So, he had finally found a way to keep the ice from melting. But there was still a second massive barrier left. That was the problem of transportation, specifically how to ship this incredibly heavy ice to the other side of the world for next to nothing.
From an economic perspective, this is a textbook example of maximizing idle assets. At the time, ships heading to the West Indies to bring back sugar and spices had to sail there completely empty. To balance the ships, crews had no choice but to fill that empty space with rocks or dirt. Tudor took that exact space and turned it into a shipping network that cost him practically nothing.
Yes, he solved the supply chain puzzle brilliantly. But that is exactly where Tudor experienced his paradoxical first failure. On his first voyage, the ice did not melt at sea, but rather after it had already reached its destination. There was no ice house to safely store the solid blocks of ice, and there was no one who recognized its value enough to buy it. In the end, under the scorching Caribbean sun, the ice piled up on the docks was nothing more than cold rocks melting away, right in front of the locals.
How did he turn those cold rocks, melting away uselessly on the docks, into a precious gem that everyone craved? This is the exact moment. Frederic Tudor evolved from an extraordinary businessman into a marketing pioneer who created a market out of thin air.
That is exactly where Tudor figured out the formula for creating demand all on his own. He went to the busiest bar in Havana, personally taught the bartender how to make iced cocktails, and let the customers try their first glass for free. For people who had spent their entire lives drinking lukewarm rum, that crisp, biting coldness was a literal revolution for their taste buds. It was a whole new world they could never turn back from once they had a taste.
That is exactly the key point. This went far beyond simply handing out free drinks. He permanently engraved a brand new standard of value, the sheer pleasure of coldness, into people's minds. He essentially created an irreversible baseline for their taste buds, making it impossible for them to ever go back to lukewarm drinks once they had a taste.
A taste lock-in effect. That is the perfect way to put it. Those blocks of ice that initially melted helplessly on the docks because there was nowhere to store them became the starting point of a massive butterfly effect. It went far beyond just the experience of a single drink, completely transforming the landscape of our dining tables, industries, and even medicine.
That is exactly the point. Those blocks of ice that once melted helplessly on the docks have now become the most brilliant gems in our bartenders' glasses. The very phrase we use, "on the rocks," is Tudor's great legacy. Ice goes far beyond simply chilling a drink. It rounds out the sharp edges and brings the scattered flavors together, truly acting as the conductor of taste.
Yes, and I believe the absolute peak of that butterfly effect was the popularization of ice cream. Those once unwanted blocks of ice that initially melted helplessly on the docks, without a single warehouse to store them, became a true turning point in history. They took ice cream, which was once an exclusive luxury for royalty, and brought it right to the center of everyday life and social gatherings for ordinary people.
Yes, that is exactly right. Those blocks of ice that initially melted helplessly on the docks, without a single warehouse to store them, blossomed into the dazzling culture of cocktails and ice cream. But what I find even more thrilling is how this change went far beyond simple culinary pleasure, completely revolutionizing the massive systems that sustain human life. It provided the very first answer to the seemingly impossible question of how fresh fish could ever make its way to dining tables in cities deep inland.
That is exactly right, and that answer was the birth of the cold chain, the very heart of modern logistics. Thanks to Tudor's ice, refrigerated railcars could finally cross the continent. It turned the unimaginable into reality, bringing Chicago beef to New York dining tables and fresh ocean fish to inland plates.
Yes, it was truly a Copernican turning point. That failure during the first voyage, where the ice melted helplessly on the docks because there was no warehouse to store it, actually became the starting point for the massive success of the cold chain. Thanks to that, inland dining tables, which had relied solely on salted fish for centuries, could finally experience the true freshness of the ocean.
Its impact did not stop at the dining table. It changed the landscape of a completely unexpected place. The very glasses we hold in our hands, the reason the lager beer we love today was able to overcome seasonal limitations, was entirely thanks to Tudor's ice.
It is truly fascinating how a simple piece of cold ice went beyond the dining table to completely shake up the landscape of the beer industry. As you mentioned, It is a perfect example of how a single innovation can trigger a chain reaction that drives the growth of other industries. But the impact of this ice did not stop merely at the realms of industry and the culinary arts. It expanded into perhaps the most fundamental area of all, the very front lines of saving human lives.
Yes, that is precisely where Tudor's ice proved its value to human history, transcending its status as a mere luxury. In an era devoid of modern medicine, a high fever was not merely a symptom of an illness, but the very culprit that claimed lives. Especially when terrifying epidemics like yellow fever swept through, lowering a patient's body temperature was the only means of survival, making ice their last line of defense. In the end, he was not just selling coldness, but the precious time needed to save lives.
That is exactly where Tudor's business became a monumental innovation. Going far beyond the mere pursuit of profit, he completely changed the destiny of ice. As a commodity, he elevated what was once a luxury enjoyed by a select few to the status of an essential public good that protected the lives of everyone.
From saving lives to becoming an essential good, it truly makes you realize how far the ripples of change created by one man's sheer determination can reach. But the most surprising part of all this innovation is that Tudor did not actually invent the ice, the ships, or the sawdust himself. He was the one who designed a new relationship, connecting elements that already existed, but were scattered.
That is exactly the point that elevates Tudor from a mere businessman to a great innovator. In economics, true entrepreneurship is not the realm of an inventor who creates something out of nothing. It is the power of an architect who connects resources that already exist in the world, but whose value went unnoticed, drawing an entirely new constellation of value.
That is an excellent point. Tudor did not create the individual stars of winter, sawdust, or empty ships. Instead, he was the one who discovered the hidden paths between those stars that no one else could see, and he drew a new constellation of value. That is precisely the kind of profound insight that changes the course of history.
Not an inventor, but a designer of relationships. That is the perfect conclusion to today's story. His first failure reminds us that the ice, which remained solid while crossing the ocean, melted away helplessly upon arriving at the port. A great connection does not end with the act of connecting itself, but is completed by the power to imagine the new ground, where its value will take root. I believe that is exactly where innovation in our own time begins.
Listening to this makes me realize that countless possibilities are just being thrown away in my kitchen every single day. It deeply resonates with me that I should not just view the leftover parts of excellent ingredients as mere sawdust. Instead, I need to envision the ice house, where their value will truly shine, meaning an entirely new recipe. Tonight, I am going to seriously think about designing a new recipe of my own.
Well, I want to extend my deepest thanks to Oliver, Simon, and Helena for such a profoundly insightful conversation today. To our viewers, as you enjoy a cold drink tonight, why not take a moment to reflect on the insight of a man who went beyond the mere imagination of shipping ice across the ocean and actually designed the sturdy warehouses that would keep it from melting. Perhaps true innovation, the kind that connects the ordinary things around us in entirely new ways, truly begins with the wisdom to look ahead to the new ground, where that value will eventually take root. This has been The Curious Table. Please like and subscribe, as it is a huge help in creating these videos.